Welcome, everybody. This is our first live stream in a series of a little bit more deep dives into Cowlitz County and some of the specific issues that impact Cowlitz County. The general topic for today is infrastructure. I'm Joe. I'm a candidate for county commissioner here in Cowlitz County, and I'm joined by my friend Josh. Josh is out of Boston, so not as familiar with the with Cowlitz County, which is cool because we get to talk about stuff from like the very beginning. How you doing, Josh?
Good. I'm good. I'm excited to learn a lot today. I have spent very little time on the West Coast and zero time in Washington or Cowlitz County. So educate me as you usually do.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that as a relatively new person to the area, having only been here about 3 years, I recognize I need to do a lot of research and spend a lot of time understanding the makeup of this area. Um, the founding of Cowlitz County um, really starts in like the late 1880s, somewhere around there. But that's not where the story begins. I want to make sure to start out today with an acknowledgement of the one of the challenges of the history of Cowlitz County. Um, Cowlitz County historically was populated by Native American tribes. Um, Generally, we think about them as the Cowlitz tribe, but there were quite a few different communities that were not all unified under one central umbrella, although there was a central name. Um, and a lot of the history of Cowlitz County prior to the founding of the towns that exist today has been largely lost. This is not today a review of the history of those tribes that we know, but I want to make sure to acknowledge up front that there were about 6,000 people, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people in Cowlitz County prior to anything that we're talking about today. Through the 1830s, there were disease outbreaks, cholera and measles, that meant by the time European settlers came to this land, there were very, very large parts of it that were uninhabited. Most of those people lived along the Cowlitz River and along the Columbia River, which snakes down northwest to southeast, or the other direction, southeast to northwest. And so that's part that I want to start with up front. Just acknowledging that was a very big part of the makeup of the land. This was not, totally unoccupied land that nobody had claimed yet, but at one point it was somewhat empty. And so as we get into the founding of the five major towns in this area, we got to acknowledge that that's kind of what it was built off of, right? Yeah, and I know too. So one of the things that's interesting in comparing it to like Boston, for example, which I know, Josh, you're not like from Boston, but it's the area that I know and that I've like visited. Much of the East Coast has a long history, like going back, to the mid 1700s. I remember traveling to Boston and seeing a map of Paul Revere's route. um, there's a book I have back here called the Fire of Liberty, and it talks a lot about the state of things during that time. The Pacific Northwest does not have that kind. The Pacific Northwest does not have that kind of history. It's in the grand scheme of things, relatively new, relatively young, and by that I mean it's about 120, 150 years old. But okay, so I want to take you through a brief history, as best I can, of the foundings of the five major towns in Cowlitz County. I'm going to start with the town of Kalama, or the city of Kalama. So the city of Kalama was platted in 1871. Platting, by the way, is like, best I can tell, mapped. It was like written down somewhere that there was a town called Kalama around 1871. And it was built as part of the expansion of, I think it was the North Pacific Railroad. trying to draw a rail line from Portland to Tacoma, which is in the center of the state of Washington. The town was incorporated in 1871, and all of what I read said like it doubled in size. And what I found out was doubling in size meant it went from about 400 people to about 700 people. So, um, but at any rate, it was framed as almost like competing with Portland for the potential for growth, which was very interesting to me. Um, by 1879, it seems like that excitement had died down. And they actually reincorporated in 1902. And then in 1912, their roads were paved for the first time. So this was like the first sort of established town in this area. There were others that predated them in terms of when they were like settled, but this was the first one that was incorporated as an official town within Cowlitz County. Um, One of the things that was very interesting to me about Cowlitz County and the cities within it is the impact of flooding. Flooding is a huge part of our history. In 1882 and in 1894, Kalama experienced severe flooding. Stories I've read, there's conflicting stories about like when exactly the floods were, but the one in 1894 is said to have made the Columbia River 20 miles wide, which is nuts because it's not nearly that wide in almost any part today. Um, and so Kalama like dealt with some of that as part of its founding, which I thought was pretty interesting. Um,
I'm looking at a street view of Kalama right now, and while it is beautiful right on the Columbia River, I could see how flooding has caused some issues there for sure.
Yeah, so if you're looking at that map, on the west side, right, is the Columbia River, and right against the river there's like industrial sections. To the east of the highway, that whole town is up on a hill. So you're basically like driving up at like a 30-degree angle, getting out from the highway out up into the hillside of Kalama. Um, that makeup means that they're a little less susceptible to flooding in some areas, but it's actually like lower in some parts as far as I can tell, it's lower in some parts than the river level. Which means that if the Columbia River is to, raise even just a little bit, there's that risk again of flooding. The whole topic of this is infrastructure, right? And one of the things we have to acknowledge is that there is a sincere risk of that kind of thing happening again. We haven't had a very big flood like that in quite a while. I think the last one was maybe 30 years ago. But, Kalama is susceptible like any of the other towns that are directly along a river, right? Um, cool. And then the next one is Kelso. So Kelso is further north. There's a smaller area called Carroll's between Kalama and Kelso, but Kelso is kind of the next major like metropolitan area. Kelso was founded by one guy largely. His name is Peter Crawford. He was a surveyor by trade and came from the city of Kelso in Scotland. He bought a bunch of land in the 1840s, and then in 1881 he split it up into 500 plots with the intention of establishing a town in Cowlitz County. There was some record I read that talked about like, this guy Peter Crawford has all this cool property for sale, and you should come out and come live in Kelso. He donated some land as well in 1884 to build a train depot because at that point we did have railways coming up through. I think a couple acres of land to help make it so that the railway could stop in that area. And so the town was platted, was mapped out in 1888 and incorporated in 1889 or 1890. I read a source or two that conflicted there, but it seems like January of 1889. Initially, the towns of Kelso and one called Catlin, they were separated, and they were separated by the Cowlitz River. So if you look on that same map, you'll see an area that is referred to as West Kelso. It's like there's like Kelso, and then directly southwest of it across the Cowlitz River is another small section. It has like the Three Rivers Mall and things like that today. That was an entirely separate city called Catlin, and they eventually were annexed, but it was only after building a bridge across the Cowlitz River that Kelso and Catlin became one town. That bridge was built in 1904, and then in 1906 there was another huge flood. This was another flood besides the one that happened in 1882, and in this case it wiped out the bridge between Catlin and Kelso. It was like a drawstring bridge. There was a few deaths, if I remember correctly. But the Cowlitz River flooded once again, so that happened in November of that year, and then in December of that year it happened again. And it took until December of 1907 to rebuild that bridge, at which point, as far as I can tell, at which point Catlin and Kelso became one town. Catlin was then referred to from that point on as West Kelso, after the building of the bridge that connected those two across the Cowlitz River. So, again, yeah, dude, flooding is a big part of all this. I think you'll keep seeing that theme as we go through these here. Okay. Next is Castle Rock. So Castle Rock, you're going up the highway a little bit more. There was a very big rock formation. It was a volcanic rock that looked vaguely like a castle. What was interesting is actually like the sort of this was a landmark in the area. But as far as I can tell, the development of Castle Rock was based on a guy named Uncle Billy and his wife Susan. William and Eliza Jane Huntington. They lived right near Castle Rock, and they were known for being especially hospitable. There was a little sign, I remember finding a source, talked about how the North Pacific Railroad built a track through the Castle Rock area. Uncle Billy built a public house, so just like an open building that people could come and sleep in if they were traveling through. And there was a sign next to the open house that said, you can always get something to eat of the old man who lives behind the rock. He was like known, him and his wife were known for like never turning anybody away who needed help, even if they couldn't pay, for whatever they were being offered. And that was like the reputation for Castle Rock in the area. That was in 1871 when the railroad built their track through. In 1886, a gal named Sarah Pyle designed and wrote out kind of what Castle Rock was, and then in 1890 they incorporated into Castle Rock. By 1899, Castle Rock was the only city in Cowlitz County with a high school. So, as far as building any kind of community, there were, I think, 286 students at that time that were part of the high school. But it was largely because there was that railway all the way through that it even existed, right? Again, in 1903 and in 1906, Castle Rock also dealt with its own flooding. The 1906 flood was especially bad. The Cowlitz River this time was the one that flooded, and it was purported to be 18 feet above its normal level. So, like, that's nuts. I think the Columbia River flooding, there were some documents that said it was like 1 or 2 inches above the normal level, and because there was so much water, it was all the way spread out, and there's so much flat land. But the Cowlitz River being 18 feet above its normal level meant that about half of all the buildings in Castle Rock and the surrounding area were wiped out at that time. Quote here, many were glad to escape with only their lives, leaving everything behind them, and quite a number had lost everything. Happily, no lives were lost. So again, that's like a big part of the history of these towns is, they're susceptible to that kind of risk. Next, we can talk about Woodland. I'm kind of breezing through these here because I do want to spend time on them, but also it's just important to kind of get the lay of the land, right?
Yeah.
These are sort of in order by when they were incorporated. Um, Woodland was mapped in 1889, so right around the same time that Castle Rock was incorporated, and then the city of Woodland itself incorporated in 1906. This area dealt with the same floods in 1894 when the Columbia River overflowed. Um, and the Lewis River Bridge, which is at the very very bottom. If you actually go on the map and you look at an area called Horseshoe Lake,
Okay.
that bridge that crosses over the Lewis River, that one was kind of described as like the boon of Woodland. Woodland is at the very bottom end of Cowlitz County, connecting it with Clark County. And the Lewis River Bridge gave the ability to cross between Clark and Cowlitz County because the Lewis River just kind of cut that stuff through. Before that, you had to do ferries, and even with the bridge being built, it was not like an easy trek up through Cowlitz County. But that bridge being built was a big part of the development of the town of Woodland and it kind of growing into what it is. That was finished in 1913. Through the 1910s and the 1920s, all of the roads started to be improved. So, like I said, in 1912, Kalama got its roads paved. Later, towards the 1920s, like Woodland and the surrounding towns all started to get more concrete or gravel or things like that. A lot of the travel in this area had to navigate around these very big rivers. And so you could either cross over by ferry along different points along the Columbia River, or you could find a way to travel on foot. By this time, there were vehicles. But a lot of the landscape was just like really messy. In 1922, the Pacific Highway, what's now I-5, was opened. And from everything that I've read, the development of the Pacific Highway is like the reason that these towns can exist. You can kind of see if you look at the map too, like all of these towns are along I-5, and there's stuff that's further out, like the Spirit Lake Highway and things like that. But there's not really anything outside of, with some exception, there's not really anything outside of that main corridor of I-5.
So true. When you sorry, when I just looked it up on the map and then kind of Google maps out the entire county, you're so right. It's all these towns obviously dot the river because river feeds the industry, right? And
Right.
also and the railroad. But yeah, there's just nothing to the east. I mean, there are things obviously, but it's
Yeah.
all concentrated in that I-5 area.
Yeah, and off to the east, up to the northeast corner of Cowlitz County, there's the Spirit Lake Highway. So that takes you up to areas like Tootle. There's a town called St. Helens up there, and a few other smaller communities. But even then, there's not much economic development. I was talking with somebody a few weeks ago, and they live up in the Tootle area, and I was asking like, hey, is there anywhere that we could like meet? Maybe we get a coffee, whatever. And he goes, yeah, there's not really any like businesses out here. There's basically just Drew's. Drew's is like a gas station and a convenience store, and it's the only building, like the only like center of commerce up that way. So you really do have to drive down from those areas down into Castle Rock, down into Kalama. You can go north up into Lewis County as well, but folks out that way don't have much to purchase out there. They got to travel, into town. It's one of the things I think that's really cool about Cowlitz County is that, if you want to find a place where you can kind of keep to yourself, maybe there's a smaller community, but you don't have to be as influenced by all of the, the bustle of the city. You can, and there are places within Cowlitz County that you can find that kind of refuge, maybe is the right word.
Yeah.
So all of these towns were founded in, right around the turn of the 20th century, so right around the beginning of the 1900s. The last town, and the one that is today one of the most prominent, is Longview. Longview's where I live. It's where we've lived for the last couple of years. And Longview does not have the history of settlement that any of the other towns we've talked about today have. Longview was built. It was created by a sawmill or a mill company called the Long Bell Corporation in 1923. Well, 1918. This guy, his name is Robert A. Long, also called R.A. Long, but according to a book like this one, this is R.A. Long's Planned City, the story of Longview. According to this book, he only ever went by Mr. Long. Even his wife called him Mr. Long, which I thought was an interesting little tidbit. Because he's referred to generally as R.A. Long today. He had a major stake, if he wasn't the owner of the Long Bell Company or Long Bell Corporation. And in 1918, they started to realize that their lumber shores were drying up. They were based out of Kansas City. They had some stuff, I think, up towards like Michigan area. But they were like, oh, well, the Pacific Northwest, that's a great spot. And there's lots of trees out there. So they sent out engineers in 1921 to go and survey this area. One of the guys' name is Vandercook. He set up shop in Kelso and basically took to like drawing out all of the different areas of Cowlitz County and, kind of estimating their value for the timber industry. One observation I thought was particularly interesting. Vandercook said, when the trees are farmed out of this area, it will not be suitable for anything else. So it seemed to me like their opinion at the time was like, we're going to come in here and we're going to, take the trees, but like this land isn't really good for anything else. I've talked with people today in the county administration and kind of validated that that's true. We have a lot of hillsides. We have a lot of like rough gradients, and a lot of the area is very wet. One of the guys in this story of the development of Longview referred to various areas as like peat bogs. And I remember one thing he said was, he's like, this is a quote from the book. "This is not an exaggeration." That was like the start of his quote. "You can jump in one spot and watch a bush shake 100 feet away." Like, so very unstable, right? But they decided that they wanted to come out here and build this city because they recognized, like, hey, if we're going to go and have a mill here, we need to have some place for all of our mill employees to live. And so they took to planning out this city, Longview, kind of like doing it on their own. They went and purchased a bunch of land down towards like the southwest, kind of the crook of the Columbia River out there, and built this town up in something like 10 years. Like, the development was incredibly quick. R.A. Long was noted as being very worried about being annexed by Kelso. He was worried that like Longview would not be able to like stand on its own as a town. And so, as the story goes, they pushed really, really hard for things to develop very quickly, to the point where, oh gosh, there was one story I read that kind of like solidified this for me as like, kind of the way that this built up. They had this like Founders Day celebration in the early 1920s. And the way the story goes, they said everybody was so excited and there was so much like positivity that nobody really was upset to find out that the hotel where the event had been hosted at had not yet had its sewer lines hooked up. And so they used the basement as a temporary septic tank for the celebration. Like, that was kind of the nature of the forming of Longview. It was done very quickly. It was ambitious, but they kind of cut corners through the development of it. We'll talk more later about like how that impacts the existing like public works infrastructure and things like that. But the point I'm making here is that like the founding of Longview is framed as this, amazing, planned city with all this forethought, and they did everything right. And I think for good reason, a lot of the people here are pretty critical of the way that this all happened. It seems very much like a corporation came in and just did what they wanted and pushed really hard for things without a lot of concern or care for the long-term impact of those decisions. One engineer, Vandercook, on multiple occasions decided as saying, hey guys, like we're going really fast here. We're like not taking enough time to make sure that everything's kind of in the right order. We're trying some things and they don't seem to really be working, and we keep going forward with those plans anyway. And it seems like that drive to like legitimize the city of Longview really forced them to like not take into consideration all of the impact of what they were doing. So those are the five major towns, and you can probably tell just in my description of this like how Longview is perceived, in this area. It's the biggest city today. It's like kind of the largest like commerce center and things like that. It has the largest population, but it's sort of historically and kind of just showed up. you know, that's been challenging. There have been multiple bids for Longview and Kelso to become one town. Initially, Kelso was the one who prompted it, and Longview rebuffed them. And then later, Longview came and said, "Hey, actually, yeah, we might want to be in a same town." And the people of Kelso were like, "No, we're not interested anymore." So there's been this like rivalry for at least the first maybe 50 years or so of the forming of the town. But all right, I just like rambled a bunch. What questions or observations does that present for you, friend?
Well, no, I mean, I think it obviously it's really interesting to understand and see how flooding has played a role in this. I guess, and if you're going to get into this later on, do so. But I think naturally the connotation between railroads and kind of the foundation of towns throughout our nation's history has been tumultuous to say the least. So I'm curious about like outside of the floodings, how has or was the rail industry perceived back then? Was it welcome because it allowed Cowlitz County to kind of form and build these
Mm,
towns, or is there some controversy there as well?
that's interesting. I think because the towns were at that point like by the time all these towns were established, the wood production industry was pretty massive. Railroads represented a good flow of passenger traffic, and that was kind of it as far as I can tell, because the rivers allowed for a lot of the transportation of wood, and so they didn't need to rely on the railroads that much. Um, the railroads themselves aren't featured a whole ton in most of what I read, and so I don't know that there was a real strong opinion on them. But it's what allowed people to come out and see these areas and get there relatively quickly. Most of the executives of the Long Bell Corporation, for example, traveled by train from Kansas City to these areas. Um, I think you could have seen it as them coming and trying to, sort of build their own thing. But honestly, it seems to me like Cowlitz County was sort of passed through by these organizations. Again, like the development of the railroad that came up through Kalama was specifically a discussion about how to get from Portland to Tacoma, and Cowlitz County was just kind of in the middle of that, without a whole lot of impact at the time. Now later on, railroads did have some meaningful impact. For example, we've had I think two head-on train collisions in Cowlitz County. So we've had a few like disasters as a result of it. But yeah, but I haven't seen much to suggest that there was a huge negative impact or even a negative perception by the railroads at the time. Peter Crawford built or like I said, donated money for a small train depot, and that was generally seen as exciting by the people of Kelso. So yeah, that's about what I know. I'm sure that other people could give me more information on that too. But
Okay. Yeah. No, I was just curious. I was just curious, and yeah,
cool.
I mean, my only other observation is it was funny, like as because I obviously have purview into your outline and your agenda today, and
Right.
I've been following these towns on the map, right? And as soon as we hit Kelso, I was like, yeah, but what about Longview? Like, it seems
Yeah.
like oh, it's
Well,
right there. It butts up right against it. So I was very interested in that
yeah.
development.
Yeah, this book here, this the story of Longview is super interesting. Again, I think that the way that it's characterized is like, this was a business that said we need a town, and it seems to me, from what I can tell, the people outside of Longview were not generally very positive about Longview's existence. Now, this titan of industry that RA Long was, um, I think like led to a lot of like, hey, we're just going to sort of push through. We're going to see how far we can get. Um, but as we get further on, like some of the challenges came back to the Long Bell Corporation not really wanting to work with the citizens of the area. So there were stories later on, I think in the 1950s, maybe earlier than that, where the corporation had or was at the time funding some of the city infrastructure, and as soon as the city of Longview incorporated and had the ability to start charging taxes, it seems like the corporation started to back away from their involvement at all, which sucked because it meant that there was no other source of money besides taxing their constituents, right? I get it, I do, but it feels like we kind of got bled in a way, and never really like built back up on our own. The history of Cowlitz County seems to me to be characterized by a lot of earnest efforts in the face of a lot of hardship. Um, I want to move forward to another very, very impactful part of the development of Cowlitz County here, which is the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Um, I'd like to take a short break, though, if we can, just so that we can jump into that and hit on it on its own. Cool. All right. Let me pause this real quick. Okay, so the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 is the other kind of big point in the history of Cowlitz County. I'd grown up in this area. I grew up in Clark County in Vancouver, and so I knew about Mount St. Helens. I think it's like global news. Hey, a volcano erupted in western or southwestern Washington. Mount St. Helens is at the eastern edge of Cowlitz County, and one of the things that did not really click with me until I started doing a lot more research into this is just how much we are feeling the impact of Mount St. Helens today. It's 40 at this point, 44 years ago, 43 years ago, and I had kind of in my own mind said, I imagine that there's not much going on, still related to this volcanic eruption. But I'll give you a couple of like highlights, points that really like kind of struck this for me. So the ash from the volcanic eruption spread over 22,000 square miles. Most of the cities were covered in ash. There's one photo in here. I got this other book, Cowlitz County Then and Now. Let's see if I can get to the one with the mall. Where the area with the Three Rivers Mall is, oh gosh. See, I had seen this photo and I just got the impulse to go and look at it. Okay, here it is. So on the left here is the Three Rivers Mall. You can see that big white building there in the center. Prior to this, it was the Kelso Elks Club golf course. And that's here on the right. Yeah. That is all ash. That big pile of stuff down here, that is just like straight up ash that was collected. And like that was felt everywhere, right? But here in Cowlitz County, we got a lot of like the direct impact of that. Let's see. 0.67 cubic miles of earth was like, so you think a cubic mile, right? Was ejected from the area. And we had over $1 billion in 1980 dollars of timber and civil works deconstruction and cleanup as a result of it. Specifically, the impact that Cowlitz County felt was in the cleanup, was in the debris that fell. So if you look again on that same map, over towards the east, there's a lake near Mount St. Helens called Spirit Lake. Well, all that debris ejecting from the volcano fell into the lake, raised the levels of the lake much higher than they were before. And so the runoff of that, like all of the debris that was there, pushed water down towards the towns, down towards the 5 major towns we've seen. To combat this, there were a couple of things that were built to try to deal with the debris that are active today and are currently managed by, among others, the Forest Service and the Department of Transportation. I actually went out there a couple weeks ago or actually earlier this week, to take some photos of the sediment dam. Let me see if I can get to where this is at. So the sediment retention structure, this is an area that we're currently maintaining here in Cowlitz County. I'll try to show you on my phone here.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, so the river coming up here, this is the North Toutle River. Yeah. Down here, there are cement structures that are holding back sediment that was being flown through. Right through here, this is a flow for water, and that has needed to be added to. That's the spillway, and the goal of that is that when the river runs down and it's carrying debris, the debris is caught in that spillway. They had to raise the level of the spillway. I think it was 7 inches back in the mid 2010s or thereabout. And part of this again is just to like mitigate the risk of flooding from all the water that's coming from there. We have a lot of individual like roads and loose land and things like that were affected by that debris flow. But the impact of Mount St. Helens on the eastern part of Cowlitz County was like very, very direct. I want to see if I can pull up a map with the spread of Mount St. Helens. Yeah, here it is. So again, you're looking at that same map and kind of seeing where Mount St. Helens is in relation to Cowlitz County. Here's the impact zone of the volcano. Oh gosh, seeing it on the camera, but you can see the red lines there, right? Um, Volcano down there on the bottom right, and it spread out. It blew out all the roads out that way. There was one bridge, the Hartford Creek Bridge, that had to be rebuilt. Weyerhaeuser, which at the time was like the biggest lumber producer and had a bunch of like forest out there, invested millions of dollars into retilling the soil to break up the very thick ash deposits, and then reintroducing trees there to try to build up the growth. Um, the signs that are out there by the Hartford Creek Bridge talk about how Weyerhaeuser planted these trees knowing full well that they would not see any return on that investment for, for 20 some years, but did so in part because it was like, well, this will help rebuild the lumber part of Cowlitz County and help rebuild the vegetation there. If they hadn't done that, we would have had very thick ash deposits across all the area right around the volcano, and that would have been mostly impermeable, which would mean that like water could not flow through it. So we would have seen more of that flooding whenever there was rain, because all the water would collect on top of that ash deposit and spill down into the rivers and lakes, and by extension down into the cities. So we do a lot today to even manage the impact of that. And yeah, I mean, it's a volcano, so it has all the impacts that a volcano has. But that was what was most surprising to me, is that 44 years later we are still thinking about this, and still doing things. Like, there's still active investment in making sure that the impacts of that volcano are not like readily felt. Yeah. What do you think about that? Is that wild?
Wild. It is. It really is. I mean, because everybody hears about Mount St. Helens, but I mean, before we started this, I really had never heard about Cowlitz County, which is kind of insane, right? Like,
Sure.
it was the largest impact, and maybe that's just me not digging deep into Mount St. Helens. I'm sure as soon as I really flip past the first or second page, it would have been mentioned. But it's also just it's bewildering and shocking how much work is still going into the aftermath of it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the the flooding risk is especially apparent. Other things there, by the way, are like landslides. So Skamania County, which is just east of Cowlitz County and also encroaches on some of the blast zone, they had a landslide where our Department of Emergency Management went and got involved. Larry, the guy who's the head of our DEM, came and spoke at a course that I'm taking on law enforcement and justice here in Cowlitz County, and he talked about the need for us to be involved for the sake of like managing communication. Cowlitz County, I think, I would argue, has felt like the most direct impact from that volcanic eruption, but we're not the only ones, right? Like further north and further east as well, other communities had the same kind of stuff that they're dealing with. The volcanic eruption, I think, mostly flowed. The volcanic eruption mostly flowed southeast, and so if you go to Mount St. Helens, the crater is like facing from the southeast side of it. I also have photos, by the way, of Mount St. Helens. Here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. And you can see it like literally just like lost its top, just blew up. One other while we're doing pictures, here is Castle Rock, by the way. It's gonna be hard to see in the black and white.
Oh, but I get the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and the only part that's changed, so Castle Rock is down here on this side. The only part that's changed is the trees are a lot taller. It's still quite a bit larger. But yeah, so Mount St. Helens, I think, was the other kind of pinpoint of impact in our area, and the impact of that is even, like I said, still being felt today. I think what is most pointed for me is the instability of the ground and the risks of flooding that are coming from, among other things, that like sediment deposit. We are going to be probably working for another few decades thinking about the way that we manage all of this debris that was shot off from this volcano and is still kind of around as part of our history. So
Yeah, that's wild.
yeah. All right. I want to jump into the next topic here. I want to talk a little bit more about like the philosophy of the government's role in infrastructure. But before I do, Josh, any questions or observations or clarifications that you have?
No, I feel pretty good up to this point. Just
Cool.
taking it all in. I'm still like, yeah, the whole Mount St. Helens thing, man. I again just total. I didn't realize it's right in your backyard, and I think it's still just. I think what you guys are still doing today
Yeah.
to clean up from it is throwing me for words.
Well, that's all right, man. All right, let's jump into the next section here. Here.
Okay.
All right, Josh, can you talk for a second?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. I think I figured out what was going on. We might have I might have to go back and remix the audio for part of the live stream bit here. Um, but I think that'll do it. Hopefully. Um, cool. Why don't we just keep going? I
Yeah.
can see the audio going through on my side, and it looks like it's happening consistently, so I think we'll be okay. Um, let's jump into the philosophy of government here. Um, I just kind of wanted to talk about the necessity, I think, of the government being involved in this part of management of the like the county problem, that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Josh, like what's your perspective, if you don't mind sharing with me, of like the government being involved in like roads and the transportation infrastructure and the
Yeah.
emergency, like any like preconception that you have at this point of that topic.
Sure, we have preconception, right? I
Of
think
course.
that it's one, I think from a high level that it's obviously important and infrastructure is important. And I think that local, state, and federal government all play a part in creating and maintaining strong infrastructure. But I also think like infrastructure catches the same flack as most things in government, that it's slow moving, that it's not, there's not a lot of oversight, waste of money in a lot of cases, or maybe we feel like the projects that they run aren't run as efficiently in terms of how they're budgeted for and the amount of time that they take, right? So, not saying that I technically or always feel that way, but I also am living in an area where I've seen the same highway project probably be going on for the last 10 years, right? And I'm not an expert, so I don't know the nuances behind it either.
Yeah, I think you're characterizing kind of the frustrating part of this being in the hands of a bureaucratic, right, structure
Hmm.
We talked before about different philosophies for the role of government, and I'll make a case for like the government doing this sort of thing.
Hmm.
But if you remember from our discussion about like the structure of government, right, and specifically where we put like a representative republic, like what we have today, um, pretty much every time we get into something like this, it comes at the expense of that speed to action, right?
Right.
I think you're hitting on that like right away. There's an argument made here that the government should be the one providing this public good, right?
Yeah.
This is a necessity. This is something that without good transportation, without the ability for us to travel to and from places, very few other things become accessible to us, right? We have to rely on transportation in order to go to work, in order to engage with the economic side of things. If we want to go and shop, if we want to get goods and resources, if we want to go and get an education, all of those things rely very heavily on that public infrastructure being available. And putting that into the hands of private organizations, without some kind of oversight, would mean that things happen a lot faster. But it might come at the expense of the quality of that work, right? Part of the reason that we have these structures is to help enforce regulation and make sure that things are done well. It might also mean that we are less conscious of the environmental impact of all of that work. I know people get frustrated at the idea of like putting this into the hands of a bureaucracy, and I agree in principle that yes, it is a challenge to have to hand something over to a government that is probably going to be doing things much slower than you would like. But because it's providing that public good, I think that's the case to be made that the government like should be involved in this, right?
Yeah.
Um, there's other like philosophical discussions to be had about the role of government in all of this, but I think the strongest argument in favor, in my opinion, of keeping this in the hands of the government is maintaining a view of that long-term impact, right? Um, if we aren't conscious of how our actions are going to have an impact on the future, um, we get a little bit more of what we want, but at the expense of people that come after. I think this is really pronounced in some of the challenges that Cowlitz County deals with today with the state of our roads. I mentioned before that the makeup of the ground is very loose in a lot of places. There's a lot of water flow. And most of the projects that we have in like our 2022 through 2027 plan are dealing with landslides. Um, Small ones most of the time, but
Yeah.
sections of road that are eroding away because we basically just built like a little culvert to allow a little river flow underneath, and now the ground is like giving way. Roads are narrowing; they're like losing the edges, and so we have a lot of slated projects. Something like I counted it up, and it's something like 9 million, $9.5 million of our annual budget. Well, not our annual budget because that's over 5 years, but $9.5 million just dealing with the impact of landslides and like just improving roads as a result of the ground falling away. Um, Kind of got on a little bit of a tangent there, but um, yeah, how does that sit with you? In that view.
Yeah, no, I mean it look, I think it's great to be able to understand the nuances and the different perspective there, right? And I also think it's like I was saying in the beginning, right? I don't understand the details of how monumental these tasks can really be and the undertaking and the planning. But no, I appreciate that detail. I appreciate how much you understand about it and the depth of knowledge that you have. Obviously, it's important for this position that you're going to be running for. So no, I really appreciate that information.
Well, and the alternative, right, which I think people might make an argument for, is that we should privatize these things. And that we should just put it into the hands of construction companies and let them maintain the quality of roads. And I understand that argument in theory, right? But I also am conscious of the risk that we're taking on in allowing an organization that is explicitly focused on profit, as all businesses naturally are, right? Um, Allowing a business that is focused on profit to manage something that is one of those public goods, right? What we know is that even if good people are in those positions, that kind of centralization under a mechanism that is designed to make money means that we are not always going to do the best thing for a community. Um, and that's kind of the counter argument to privatization, right? There have been areas of our country that we've attempted to privatize the road systems, and what we see is that they deal with some of the same problems that these public infrastructure projects do, except that at the end of it, it's like appealing to a for-profit entity who has no obligation to serve on you other than maybe a contractual one, and sometimes a weak one at that.
Yeah.
So for me, like I think that the ideal case is to figure out a system that allows us to prompt that work, right? Which in my opinion is served well by an infrastructure that allows the government to say, hey, here's the things that we should go and be working on, and then to utilize the services of private businesses to get that kind of thing done, holding them accountable as well to the quality of that work. I think that there is a collaborative effort that exists naturally today, and I do want to see improvements to that system, but I think more of that comes to the priority and the impact of those things. Um, one topic in relation to Cowlitz County is like what existing projects there are going on. So I wanted to move into that, unless you had any other thoughts about the like philosophy of government in this realm.
No, I think it's let's keep moving along.
Okay, we'll pause.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, let's talk about the current work that's being done. One of the things I think is very cool about the county commissioner position is that it is not any one person's responsibility to make sure that all of these things are driven to completion. We have an excellent Department of Public Services. I know people in the public have their opinions about, the effectiveness of government bodies, but I will say from my experience talking with people across the county administration, there are a lot of people who care a lot about doing good work. And I want to just highlight some of the things that are on the list of stuff to work through. If you go look, and Josh, I wouldn't expect you to have this like pulled up or anything, but we have a list of all of the existing projects from 2022 through 2027. There are 84 or 83 projects listed out that are on the list of improvements to be made. One of the ones that is impactful for us at this point is right now there is a lot of work being done across the county to add road signs to warn people about, harsh corners as a way of mitigating roadside accidents. The reason I say that's particularly impactful, because they're actually putting a one new sign outside in our front yard, to warn people about the road just around us. It's like a 90-degree turn. A year or two ago, we had one car that spun around that corner and hit a house. Um, so those kinds of investments at sort of a larger scale are really cool. Um, but the focus in a lot of the projects, as I was reading through them, are improvements of culverts, which means improving the way that water flow is moving, and in some cases trying to make it easier for like salmon to swim. In some cases, improving the way that water flows so that the road doesn't wash out. And like I said earlier, there are about $9.5 million dedicated over the next 5 years to dealing with the effects of landslides. $8 million dedicated to four specific areas: one called Slide Creek, one called Navala Road, North Dubois, and then Mountain View Road. All four of those roads have had natural slides. Some of them are a little more severe than others. There's some where like the road has washed out on one side, but I think the few in that list are all dealing with the roads starting to narrow. Um, I don't know how many like mountain roads you have out where you are, Josh, but here it's pretty common to like go into side spaces and find like, oh wow, I have to like stay very close to the inside of the lines here. It turns out, at least for for some parts of it, that's because the road is actually eroding, is falling away at the edges and sort of crumbling down, which I had never really recognized.
Yeah.
Um, we also have a lot happening to try to manage the impact of flooding. So, like I mentioned before, that sediment retention structure and
Yeah.
the maintenance of that, that's in part being managed by the Department of Transportation. So they have an office out that way. That's part of our investments as well into the area. And then there's a few other kind of like cool projects that are a little disconnected from the roads and things like that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
But before I do that, any like thoughts on anything I just threw out? I know it's a lot.
No, it is a lot. I think it's critical. I mean, mountain roads less, but where I grew up in Connecticut, very foresty, dark, windy
Mm,
roads. We struggle with a lot of the same issues. Not so much because I think you guys have a little bit more water,
yeah.
and the water tables are probably higher, so that doesn't help. Again, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way that the minutia, for lack of better words, how important the minutia is, all the way down not just to building the roads but making sure that we have proper signage, right? And I know that's not even the most granular thing, but just throwing it out there. So you're putting a good perspective on how many details go into something that could seem simple from a high
Well,
level.
and this is where a lot of the like county money is being spent too. One of the challenges in not having a huge tax base, which full respect to the idea that like we should not be taking more money than we need, is you have to prioritize, right? And I think in these cases, it's a lot of like, okay, well, what do we put up in front of everything else? It's fine to have stuff on the list, but this is also, I think, to some degree, Josh, why we see all of the challenges with speed, right? One of the projects I mentioned here, the Slide Creek Road, was
Yeah.
slated to be completed in 2022, and to my knowledge, there is still some improvement being done there. Although I might just not have the most up to date information. It's just like that kind of stuff just does take a while, right?
Yeah.
You kind of put a plan together and then you run into hangups with that plan. And if your plan includes 83 different areas where you need to go and invest money on just that kind of infrastructure stuff, right? Well, the stuff at the bottom of that list is just going to kind of, fall out.
Yeah.
Um, this is the hard part, I think, of also like leading in this capacity as well. Is what do you prioritize? What has the greatest impact on people? I think infrastructure too has historically been where our county commissioners have focused. Like that's where most of our money goes. It seems is maintaining the critical infrastructure. not just roads, but things like our water, right? Um, the county administration itself has a challenge, at least from my conversations with folks internally, in having money dedicated towards these larger projects at the expense of like building repair. This is one kind of side thing I wanted to chat about in the infrastructure piece, right? We've got these county administrative buildings that have things like, they need a new boiler, and you have to honestly think, right? Like, is this building getting a new boiler versus doing a kind of minor repair on it? Is that worth prioritizing above fixing the results of a landslide? How do you manage the complexity of that, and how do you decide what the right thing to work on is? And more importantly than that, or more impactful than that, how do you decide what to spend your money on? Right? This is, I think, fundamentally just the trouble with this being in the hands of a government, is you do have to think about the long-term implications of your decisions. And why I generally advocate for us, thinking about those things, but I try to push towards like action as best we can help it. I do understand the long-term impact of repairing the infrastructure, and of making sure that like the roads are safe to travel. But I also recognize that there's pulls to other things as well, and it's a genuine question of whether or not those things deserve that attention. you know Getting down to the individual county commissioners, this is why I think you start to see people hold to particular projects, and they kind of want to drive those to completion, because it's like, well, that's got to be our focus. You can't think about everything all at once and prioritize everything equally. Again, like you said, and like we've talked about before, it all comes at the expense of speed. Expediency is a wonderful ideal, but to try to wrap that up in all of this and say, oh, and by the way, you need to make all these important decisions and you need to make them quickly. It's challenging. One other thing, sorry, any thoughts or questions on that?
No,
Cool.
you're good. Please continue.
All right. One other thing to highlight real quick before we talk about alignment to values, which is the last little bit I wanted to chat through here, something called the Rails to Trails project. So Rails to Trails is an effort to use decommissioned railways in Cowlitz County as spots for hiking. So we have a lot of old railways that are no longer in use. There's one actually that runs down in our neighborhood down the road here. We have a bridge crossing over the Cowlitz River. And the idea behind the Rails to Trails project is to try to take some of those old decommissioned rail lines and turn them into tourist spaces. The challenge there comes back to mostly, I think, the ownership of that project, how the money is going to flow, who's responsible for developing it. And as far as I know, one of the commissioners who's in the position that I'm running for has been taking a very heavy hand in supporting that Rails to Trails work. I think it's awesome, and I think it's a great way to think about reusing this land that has historically just been used for railways, to try to drive more engagement into the community, try to get more people up here, and at least traveling into Cowlitz County. So that was one other just project I wanted to highlight, something I think is quite interesting, while we're on the topic of what we do with our land and what structures we build.
No, I love that. I think that's fantastic. I mean, it's something that can bring a lot to the community there, and it's perfect. It's something that the place that I grew up in, Connecticut, is doing right now. Is redeveloping old railways into walking trails and things like that are connecting multiple towns. So it's interesting to see how it's happening across the country.
For sure, yeah. All right, let's take another quick break, and then we'll talk through how this aligns with my values, and then we'll close out.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Works for
friend.
me.
All right. So the last section here, I just want to talk briefly about how this topic of infrastructure aligns with my values. Specifically, talking about the four values as part of my campaign. First, free choice with care, right? Um, in my approach to infrastructure, I want to emphasize the importance of maintaining our roads and bridges. I want to ensure that everybody has the freedom to travel and conduct their daily activities. This is about balancing, our individual freedom with like the collective responsibility to support each other, right? I think if we can maintain, if we have well maintained infrastructure, we are giving people the ability to exercise their individual choice and their freedom, right? Whether it's like work, education, leisure, um, we as the government need to be thinking about how best we can support that individual agency and try to reduce the potential harm that might come from not having those things in place. And so I think that for me is how I think about this free choice with care in alignment with like the roads and bridges.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that, Josh? I know that's not super complex, but any questions or clarifications even I can give there.
No, I think that's, like you said, it's pretty clear. So I
Cool.
feel good on that one.
The next is growing by supporting. To me, this feels even a little bit more straightforward, right? I think if we can support our community by way of making sure that we have effective infrastructure that is useful, we are also allowing our community to grow and develop. As we talked about before, right? Like the development of what at the time was called the Pacific Highway, but is now called Interstate 5,
Yep.
was one of the direct reasons why these towns in Cowlitz County were able to develop. And I think it's really important that we think about how that infrastructure is going to help us grow. We have a lot of areas within our community that are accessible through one major throughway. Like the whole eastern half of Cowlitz County is accessible only through the Spirit Lake Highway, right? And so if we aren't thinking about the the support needs that folks have, and access to services, thinking about the access to emergency services and fire in case of some kind of disaster, right? We're gonna potentially miss out on some of that potential just because we haven't done a good enough job of maintaining the supporting structures. Um, this to me is a way of ensuring that people who need that support are getting it. We didn't get into this a whole lot today, but I think like public transportation fits into this category pretty nicely as well. Access I think is probably the best word to summarize this.
Yeah.
Um, and so I that's how I'm thinking about infrastructure as part of my value set.
Yeah.
Community-led solutions is about engaging with the community to decide those priorities, right? I think that if you hold the perspective on government of anything like this, most of the people who are even pretty like anti-government have said and thought, yeah, it's okay for the government to be dealing with the roads, right? But to your point and to what we've talked about earlier, it's not enough to just say, hey, that's your responsibility. We also have to be thinking about what is focused on first. I don't know, frankly, if I would take the necessity of putting road signs in above the necessity of like rebuilding, roads and making things a little bit more accessible. And I'm not saying that those things can't happen at the same time, but if you look at the order of priority of things, that one's like kind of high up on the list. And it's also being worked on right now, while there are other parts of our infrastructure that are not being prioritized, right? That's not to disparage, by the way, any of the existing work that's being done, but that's part of why I think it's really important to engage with the community here. If we think about the impact of a community being totally cut off from the rest of the county by way of not having accessible roads, well, to me, that feels a little bit more important than making sure that we have road signs that indicate, hey, you need to slow down around this corner. I don't know. I think that I'm open to the idea that maybe that is the most important thing. And maybe there are some vocal voices in the community that think that accident prevention is the most important thing. I don't mean to argue against it, but just to say, I'm not sure that that is entirely done with the community perspective in mind. That's part of what I want to do, is I want to go and engage with the community and say, hey, given the choice between these two things, which do you think is more important, right? And help kind of get a gauge for that. If we are consciously working to involve our community in those conversations, I think we'll be just a little bit better off. I don't want to see people who feel as though their problem is not being accounted for, and then to have to make a case for why another project is just more important than that is not community based, that is not based on the perspective of people in the community saying, hey, actually, given the options between all these things, here's what we think is the most important, right? So community-led solutions for me here is about engaging with that community voice. Any clarifications on either of those 2 points there, Josh?
No, no, but cool. I love the examples, and I know you didn't mean them in disparaging ways, but I think though, especially in your community-based part, in the signs versus actual infrastructure, fixing of roads, expanding roads, public transportation, I think if not knowing your community, right, but I would imagine that there might be more vocal voices about some of those things before, but who knows, right? And sure. I think that's why it's so refreshing to hear you say that, and hear somebody who wants to get into politics that says, yeah, I want to go to the community and say, hey, like these are the options, right? This is what we're considering. What is going to benefit you? What is going to benefit the community the most?
And again, I don't mean to imply by any means that the existing people doing this work are not trying to engage with the community and are not trying to get their opinions. I think one thing that has stuck with me through all of my engagement with the county administration is how much work they do to try and engage with these perspectives, right? And so what I want to do is look at how those decisions were made and decide for myself, does it feel like this engaged with the community in the right way? Right. There are other similar cases in other areas. I talked with a county councilor in Clark County who talked about his involvement in politics, starting with building a bike lane in his community. And the impact of that was taking away the parking from all the folks in that area. I don't know that we have necessarily the same kind of problems here, but the downside of not engaging with the community is, again, that people are harmed. This is all, for me, why I want to focus on engaging with that community voice, trying to find efficient ways to get that perspective. Yeah. Because if we don't, the negative impact is going to be felt by the people who are directly, the impact is going to be felt by some people directly.
Yeah,
I think it's really important to try to account for that as best we can.
absolutely.
The last value is part of my campaign, an outcome focused government. Again, I think the important piece of all of this is prioritizing that work and thinking about what we want at the end of all of this.
Mm,
If we are trying to build a government that is focused on community benefit, right? I think we're going to have to prioritize some things that have a little bit more, immediate benefit for the long term. Um, I struggle to some degree with, prioritizing, for example, um, efforts to bring in tourism, into the community, when there are very clear, inequalities, right? There are neighborhoods that don't have the same access to resources, that don't have clean water, things like that. And so for me, the outcome I'm after is primarily just to see benefit to my community. Um, in the topic of infrastructure, I think that involves setting some clear goals for what we're trying to do. Again, this is not stepping into something that has no direction or anything like that. We actually have a comprehensive plan that is about, it's about 10 years of development in Cowlitz County, and it's running through at this point, running through 2027 right now. Um, and so, I want to support that existing work. I want to make sure that as we're thinking about the future, we're setting good goals for ourselves and strategies for um, developing a strong community. Um, that felt a little unstructured, I think. So let me narrow it down.
yeah,
I care a lot about seeing the community succeed,
yeah,
about developing a community that can support itself, that has access to resources that they need. And my interest is not in pushing a particular agenda as much as it is thinking about the future and of what these decisions are going to do for us in the long term.
mm,
For me, the goal of government is that we get what we want. And so we need to think about what we want. And then, in the topic of infrastructure, think about how our existing infrastructure supports what we want.
mm,
Through that, I think we can develop priorities.
mm,
And those priorities are going to be shaped by that community perspective, shaped by who needs supports, and all supporting the individual agency of people in our community, kind of circling back through the other values there.
yeah.
Cool. Any thoughts there, or any additional things you feel like are worth adding there, Josh?
Uh, no, because I think you just nailed that so perfectly and beautifully at the
Oh,
end there,
thank you.
Joe, that I don't want to ruin it. And I think that's a perfect place to leave our guests on the live stream and anybody viewing this after the fact.
All right, man. I appreciate you, Josh. Okay, we'll close out here. We'll see you.